Picture a narrow road in Ogimi, a small village on the northern tip of Okinawa. It's before sunrise. Women in their 80s and 90s are walking together, laughing. Not because someone told them to, not because it's on a wellness plan, because they are expected, because someone is waiting. Okinawans are significantly less likely to develop dementia than their Western counterparts, and Ogimi sits at the extreme end of that curve. This village has been doing one specific thing every single day for centuries, and it has nothing to do with medicine, supplements, or diet. I couldn't explain what I was seeing in my own patients until I found the research. Let me take you to this village first, because the geography matters. Ogimi has roughly 3,000 people. You could drive through it in about 4 minutes. There's no hospital, no urgent care, a small general store, seaweed in the window, and more centenarians per capita than almost anywhere else on Earth. The World Health Organization has formally recognized it as a longevity region. That's not a marketing label. That's a designation based on documented population health data. The numbers here genuinely don't behave the way medicine expects them to. In 1975, a cardiologist named Makoto Suzuki traveled from Tokyo to begin what became the longest-running centenarian study in history, the Okinawa Centenarian Study. Over the decades that followed, his team examined more than 1,000 centenarians. What they found wasn't just that people were living longer, it was that they were living differently. Okinawans spend roughly 97% of their lives free of any disability. Not just alive, functional, engaged, intact. And the cognitive picture was striking. Okinawans are significantly less likely than Westerners to develop dementia. Not modestly less likely, significantly. That gap held across decades of data, across thousands of participants, across multiple research teams. The first thing researchers tried to explain it with was genetics. That's always the first move. These people carry something the rest of us don't. That explanation collapsed quickly. When younger Okinawans abandoned traditional patterns after World War II and adopted a westernized lifestyle, disease rates surged within a single generation. Same gene pool, same island, same water supply. The only thing that changed was how they lived. Craig Wilcox, a gerontologist who co-led the research, put it plainly. Roughly 2/3 of the longevity advantage came from lifestyle and environment. Genetics accounted for maybe 1/3, and mostly only mattered if you were trying to push past 100. So the researchers did what researchers do. They started documenting everything: diet, exercise, caloric intake, sleep. They catalogued the sweet potatoes, the soy, the movement patterns, the low-calorie intake, and a lot of that mattered. But there was a pattern that kept surfacing in the data that didn't fit any of those categories. It wasn't a food. It wasn't a supplement. It wasn't a fitness protocol. It was something about the daily structure of life in Ogimi that seemed to be doing something specific to the brain, something the standard clinical frameworks didn't have a clean label for. The researchers noticed it. Some of them flagged it. And then, for a while, they almost filed it away as a cultural curiosity. Interesting, but not medical, not biological, not the kind of thing you could put in a treatment protocol or recommend at a 15-minute appointment. That instinct, to set it aside, might be one of the most consequential oversights in modern dementia research. But before I explain what was actually happening, I need to tell you about a patient. I've been practicing long enough to notice patterns that don't show up in lab results. One of them took me years to name: patients who test normal, Clean cognitive screens, no red flags, nothing a neurologist would act on, but who have quietly stepped back from their daily roles. Retired from work and didn't replace it with anything structured. Stopped being the person others depended on. Started filling the hours with television, phone calls, passive leisure. They look fine on paper. But I've watched enough of them over enough years to know that withdrawal is not neutral. 3 years later, 5 years later, the gaps appear. Not suddenly, gradually, then all at once. The patients who don't follow that trajectory are the ones who stayed useful, not busy, useful. The ones who kept a standing commitment with at least one other person, who had a role that required them to show up, not just for themselves, but because someone else was counting on it. A few years ago, I had a patient, a man in his early 60s, whose wife came to me concerned. He was slowing down, not dramatically, forgetting small things, losing the thread of conversations. The kind of changes families notice before any formal test picks them up. There was no clear diagnosis. His screening numbers were within normal range. I told her what I tell everyone in that situation. Watch for changes, stay active, come back if things shift. What she did next had nothing to do with medicine. She started walking every morning with a neighbor. A practical decision. She needed the company, the neighbor needed the routine. And because she was leaving the house at 6:30 every morning, her husband started getting up with her, made coffee, sat with her before she left, eventually started coming along. 2 years later, his inflammatory markers had dropped, his sleep had stabilized, his functional engagement, his presence in conversations, his follow-through on daily tasks, had held in a way I didn't fully expect given where things had been heading. I noticed it. I couldn't explain it cleanly at the time, so I went looking. What I found wasn't a single study. It was a convergence. Neuroscience, longitudinal data, epidemiology, all pointing at the same thing from different angles. The answer wasn't in the walking, it was in the obligation. The fact that someone was waiting. The fact that showing up meant something beyond personal preference. The brain, it turns out, processes that differently than it processes leisure. Very differently. And when I traced that research back far enough, it kept pointing to the same place. A village in northern Okinawa. A pattern embedded so deeply in daily life there that the people practicing it don't think of it as a health behavior at all. They just call it the way things are done. Here's what's actually happening in the brain, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The practice has a name. It's called Moai. It's not a walking club. It's not a wellness program. It's a lifelong social unit. A small group of people who form in childhood or early adulthood and stay bound to each other, structurally, for the rest of their lives. Not because they always feel like it, because they are responsible to each other. There is a commitment woven into the arrangement. You show up because someone is counting on you to show up. Every day. Not occasionally, not when it's convenient. Every day. That word, obligation, is the part Western medicine keeps stepping around, because it sounds like burden. But inside the brain, responsibility and leisure are processed through completely different circuits. And that distinction is where the protection lives. This is the mechanism. Your brain has a network called the default mode network. Neurologists abbreviate it as the DMN. It's active when you're reflecting on your own experiences, consolidating memories, planning for the future, imagining how someone else might feel. It's the circuit that makes you a continuous self, someone with a past, a present, and a reason to keep going. The DMN is also the first network to degrade in Alzheimer's disease. Before memory loss becomes visible, before any clinical screen picks it up, the DMN starts losing integrity. The connections thin, the signal weakens. What keeps it intact? Regular, meaningful activation. And among the strongest known activators of the DMN is purposeful social engagement, where you have a role, where other people's lives are slightly organized around your showing up. Not passive presence, not watching television in the same room as someone. Role-based contact, where you are expected, counted on, and responsible. That's the first layer. Alongside the DMN, Moai-style engagement also activates the prefrontal hippocampal circuit, the connection between the region that governs decision-making and the structure responsible for forming new memories. This circuit is use-dependent. It strengthens with activation and weakens without it. Leisure doesn't stress it enough to drive adaptation. Responsibility does. Then there's BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of it as the brain's maintenance protein. It supports neuron survival, drives synaptic repair, and enables the formation of new neural connections. Chronic social isolation reduces hippocampal BDNF. Repeated, meaningful social interaction upregulates it. Not any social interaction, the kind where the encounter carries weight, where you leave having mattered to the exchange. This isn't theoretical. Longitudinal data from 17 countries, covering more than 47,000 older adults, shows that social isolation reduces cognitive function measurably, even after controlling for depression and pre-existing health status. Isolation elevates CRP and IL-6, the same inflammatory markers that predict dementia risk. It reduces hippocampal BDNF. In animal models, it accelerates amyloid accumulation. Moai produces the exact opposite profile across every one of those measures. The Rush Memory and Aging Project, a major longitudinal study run out of Chicago, found that higher purpose in life was associated with a 2.4 times slower rate of cognitive decline and roughly a 30% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Not purpose in some abstract philosophical sense, purpose as a felt daily reality, the experience of being counted on, of having your presence matter to the shape of someone else's day. That's ikigai expressed not as a concept, but as a biological input. What the Ogimi data and the Western longitudinal research are describing is the same thing from two different directions. When you feel responsible to another person on a recurring, structured basis, your brain responds as though it has a reason to maintain itself. This is where it changes, the critical distinction, and this is what gets lost in the just be more social advice, is that passive contact doesn't replicate this. Watching television with someone in the room does not activate the DMN the way a real commitment does. A group chat doesn't produce the same BDNF response as a standing morning arrangement someone is depending on you to keep. The neurological benefit isn't in the proximity, it's in the stakes. It's in the fact that your absence would be felt. That's what Moai is. That's what these women walking before sunrise in Ogimi are actually doing to their brains. Not exercise, not fresh air, a daily biological signal that they are still part of something, still responsible to something, still needed. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, because Western medicine has known pieces of this for years. In 2024, the Lancet Commission on Dementia Prevention published an updated analysis. Their conclusion? Up to 45% of dementia cases are potentially preventable through modifiable lifestyle factors. Not fringe science, not alternative medicine. The Lancet, peer-reviewed, cited by neurologists worldwide. The evidence that social isolation, loss of purpose, and structural withdrawal accelerate cognitive decline is sitting in mainstream literature, fully visible to anyone who looks. And yet, walk into a memory screening appointment at most major health systems today and tell me what you hear. Your tests look fine. Try to stay active. Come back in a year. That's it. No discussion of whether you still have a structured daily role. No questions about whether someone in your life is counting on you to show up for something. No mention of the fact that retirement, without a replacement structure, is one of the least discussed dementia risk factors in clinical practice. This isn't because the doctors don't care. Most of them do. It's because the system they're working inside isn't built for this kind of intervention. The clinical default for cognitive concerns remains pharmaceutical. Cholinesterase inhibitors, memantine, and now the newest category, anti-amyloid therapies. Lecanemab was approved in 2023 with significant attention. It slows decline in early Alzheimer's by roughly 27% on one clinical measurement scale. That's a real number, and for patients who qualify, it matters. But fewer than 30% of Alzheimer's patients are even eligible for it. It costs thousands of dollars per month. It requires IV infusions and regular MRI monitoring. It is a treatment for people already in decline, with a modest effect size, available to a minority of those affected. There is no patent on MOI. You cannot file intellectual property on the concept of showing up for someone every morning. No device company generates revenue from telling a 72-year-old that she needs a standing daily commitment where her absence would be noticed. No insurance billing code exists for structured social obligation. There is no reimbursement pathway for a clinician who spends 20 minutes helping a patient architect their daily social environment instead of reviewing medication options. The FINGER trial, the Finnish geriatric intervention study to prevent cognitive impairment and disability, demonstrated measurable cognitive benefits from multi-domain lifestyle intervention in at-risk older adults. It's been published, replicated, and endorsed by the World Health Organization. That data has existed long enough for it to have changed clinical practice. In most settings, it hasn't. The standard first appointment for memory concerns looks roughly the same today as it did before that research existed. This is not a conspiracy. I want to be clear about that. It's a structural problem, and the structure is not subtle once you see it. Medicine is built around treatment. Treatment generates revenue, fits billing frameworks, and produces measurable short-term endpoints. Prevention operates on timescales that don't match quarterly reporting. A neurologist who prescribes a drug has done something documentable. A neurologist who tells you to restructure your social life has given you advice that won't show measurable results for 2 years and can't be tracked in a chart. The 15-minute appointment is not designed to ask, "Who is counting on you to show up somewhere tomorrow morning?" It's designed to run a screening tool, review symptoms, and make a prescribing decision. Everything else gets compressed into "try to stay active," which is accurate the way "eat healthy" is accurate. Technically correct. Practically useless without specifics. So the research sits in the journals. The FINGER data is there. The Rush longitudinal findings are there. The Lancet Commission numbers are there. And most patients over 65 leave their appointments without hearing a single word about the one behavioral factor that predicts cognitive trajectory better than almost any biomarker their doctor just measured. Here's what makes this harder to solve in the West than it sounds. The thing that strips structured social obligation from most people's lives isn't a bad decision. It's a good one. It's called retirement. Retirement is framed as the reward. You've worked for 40 years. You've earned the right to stop being responsible to a schedule, to a team, to a set of expectations that don't belong to you. Rest. Travel. Finally do the things you didn't have time to do. That framing isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that has neurological consequences, and almost nobody warns you about them before you walk out the door. When that daily framework disappears, when no one is waiting for you at 8 a.m., when your presence or absence doesn't reorganize someone else's day, the brain doesn't register that as freedom. It registers it as withdrawal. The DMN loses a primary activation source. BDNF production drops. The prefrontal hippocampal circuit gets less of the role-based stress it needs to maintain itself. The brain doesn't know you're retired. It only knows that the daily signals that told it to stay sharp have gone quiet. The pattern I see in my practice runs on a consistent timeline. Cognitively intact at 65. Socially active but unanchored by 70. Lunches with friends, family visits, some travel, nothing with real stakes attached. Noticeable functional gaps starting around 75. Families come in and describe it as a sudden change. It never is. The decline didn't begin at 75. It began the day the structure disappeared, and it just took years to become visible. What fills that vacuum usually makes it worse. Not dramatically, gradually. Social media creates the sensation of connection without any of its neurologically active ingredients. There's no obligation. No one is counting on you to respond. Your absence from a comment thread costs nothing. Group chats simulate the feeling of belonging without requiring anything from you that would stress the circuits that need stressing. Television with someone in the background is company in the loosest sense. Proximity without stakes, presence without purpose. None of this is morally wrong, but it's a substitution that doesn't work at the biological level, and it can happen so gradually that you don't notice the real thing has been replaced. The loneliness data makes this concrete. Adults who report frequent loneliness carry roughly a 40% higher dementia risk in longitudinal studies. But when you look at what's actually driving that number, it's not simply the absence of other people. Plenty of lonely people are surrounded by other people. What they're missing is a role. A place in someone else's daily routine where their presence is expected and their absence would disrupt something. That's the specific ingredient. Not contact, not proximity, functional belonging. The sense that the day is slightly organized around you being in it. The Ogimi elders walking before sunrise aren't protecting their brains because they enjoy each other's company, though they do. They're protecting their brains because each of them is the reason the others got out of bed. That's not a cultural nicety. That's a daily neurological event that has been compounding quietly for decades. And the fact that most people in the West retire into leisure and call it healthy aging means the drift starts without anyone raising a flag. No test catches it. No appointment flags it. It just looks like life slowing down, until it doesn't slow down, until it stops. The goal here isn't to be more social. That advice is as useful as try to stay active, technically true, practically empty. What you're building is daily contact with real stakes, where at least one other person is counting on you to show up. The commitment is the mechanism. Everything else is just the vehicle it travels in. Step 1 is the daily walk with stakes. Not a solo walk, not a casual stroll when the weather cooperates. A walk with a specific person, at a specific time, on a schedule that person is depending on you to keep. What makes it work isn't the movement. Your brain doesn't care much about the steps. What makes it work is that your absence would mean something to someone. That's the signal. Build that into a morning, and you've created a daily neurological event before most people have finished their coffee. Step 2 is adopting a role instead of a hobby. This is a distinction most retirement advice gets completely backwards. Hobbies are things you do when you feel like it. They ask nothing of anyone. Roles carry weight. You're the person who teaches the Tuesday class, who coordinates the group, who checks in on the neighbor, who mentors the younger colleague still figuring things out. The brain responds to being required in a way it simply does not respond to leisure. If you can identify one role in your daily life where someone else's day is slightly dependent on your participation, you've found the second piece. Step 3 is protecting the morning window. This isn't arbitrary. Moai groups in Ogimi meet early, and there's a biological reason that timing matters. Cortisol is naturally elevated in the first few hours after waking. It's your brain's daily activation signal, the mechanism that primes alertness and focus. Social engagement during that window, when cortisol is high, produces stronger hippocampal activation than the same activity done in the afternoon. You don't need to overhaul your schedule. You need one firm social commitment that happens before the cortisol curve drops. A morning responsibility is a different biological event than evening leisure. Step 4 is reducing passive social substitutes. Not because they're harmful in themselves, but because they're convincing replacements for something they can't actually replicate. A group chat feels like community. Scrolling through other people's lives feels like connection. TV in the background feels like company. None of them activate the default mode network the way face-to-face obligation does. None of them produce the BDNF response that comes from an interaction where your presence carried weight. The problem isn't that these things exist. The problem is that they're comfortable enough to fill the space where the real thing used to be. And you won't necessarily notice the substitution has happened until the downstream effects show up years later. One safety note before moving on. If you or someone you care about is currently on any medication for cognitive support, none of this conflicts with that. This isn't an alternative to medical guidance, it's additive. The biology here works alongside whatever else is in place. On timing. Neuroplasticity changes from consistent structured engagement are measurable on functional MRI after roughly 8 to 12 weeks of sustained practice. That's not a long time, but it is a real window. Don't assess whether this is working after 2 weeks. Give it 90 days of genuine consistency, not perfect consistency, genuine consistency, before you draw any conclusions. And to close the loop on the patient I mentioned earlier, the man who started walking every morning didn't do it because a doctor prescribed it. He did it because his wife was leaving the house and he didn't want her to go alone. He showed up every day because she needed him to. He had no idea he was doing neuroscience. He just knew someone was waiting. But there's a reason some people can do everything right. The walks, the roles, the morning structure, and still decline faster than expected. And it has nothing to do with what they're doing wrong. It has to do with something already working against them that this video hasn't touched yet. At the entrance to Ogimi village, there's a stone marker. It's old and weathered, and carved into it in Japanese are words that roughly translate to this. At 80, you are merely a youth. At 90, if your ancestors invite you into heaven, ask them to wait until you are 100. then you might consider it. That's not poetry, that's what they actually believe. Because in that village, no one is waiting to slow down. They're waiting for the group. They're walking before sunrise because someone is already outside, already expecting them. They have been doing that, together, for decades. And their brains show it. What you've heard in this video is real. The obligation, the morning structure, the daily role. These are biological inputs, not lifestyle suggestions. Building them into your routine genuinely changes the trajectory, but they work inside a larger system. And if that system has a fault in it you haven't identified yet, the progress you're building right now has a ceiling you won't see coming. The next video on your screen is about exactly that. Why certain people seem to resist cognitive decline almost entirely. Not because of genetics, not because they're doing more, but because of something specific about how the brain is protected at the cellular level. Something you can influence directly, once you know it's there. If you've just restructured your mornings, added a daily commitment, started treating purpose as biology, that matters. Don't leave the one factor you haven't addressed sitting unexamined. The next video is already there. Watch it now while this is still fresh.